be here today to share with you my current research, actually, because I have experience on the topic from different angles. First of all, from my own work. I've worked in 4 different European countries in similar type of structures. I wouldn't call them all centers, but we'll get to the name in a second. And then I also did a research last year in the US with a Fulbright scholarship on teaching and learning centers in the US. So I have a perspective at least European and US on the topic, but I would really welcome, of course, any comments and thoughts from your side, because I can always learn. These centers are so different, and in fact, this is the main point. The first point I would like to start with is that support, of course, why is it important to talk about support? We talk about innovation in teaching, use of media in teaching and learning, but support plays a very, very, very important role for that. Of course, as educators, we can do a lot. We design our courses, we sometimes have an idea, some more than others, on how to use technology, how to use innovative teaching methods, or at least effective teaching methods, but not everyone. Everyone starts at their own level, at their own pace, go their own pace. So we all need support, actually, in our work, in teaching, learning, development, and so on. But universities offer that, but in a very, very varied way. There is a huge range of structures that offer support. You can see there, we did a survey at some point and asked universities how their centers or how their teams for support are called, and you can see there some of the names. Of course, some are usually the same words appear: teaching, learning, excellence, media sometimes, assessment, innovation appears quite a lot. Whether that really is put into practice, it's another story. But sometimes learning more than teaching, Center for Learning and Teaching, that is also how you want to emphasize. But of course, the name is just a name. The structures themselves and how they are embedded in universities differ quite a lot, regardless really of the space of geographically where you're looking or the type of university. So really, really a huge variety of support structures, and that's what tempted me to look into this. Well, besides, I'm also a political scientist as my initial background, so I only moved into education a bit later in my career. So I guess this political scientist background still kicks in, and especially regarding my interest in institutional structures, processes, and so on. So this I have to already mention. So I've been looking in my research in how are these centers embedded at universities, how are they positioned, how they interact with other actors on campus, what are their roles, what are their self-perceived roles, but also how the others perceive them, use them also, make use of them, and also what's the future for those centers, because we all know, and especially those of us who work in this type of structures, during the pandemic, they became really, really center stage. So I would say, and many of the people I interviewed said that they were the ones that kind of saved the universities, allowed them to continue teaching during the pandemic, because they very quickly managed to put together resources, organize workshops, and I'm sure some of you here recognize those very, very intensive 24 hours a day activities sometimes for at least for a while in the beginning of the pandemic to switch to online. So I have to say, in an environment where most of the education was happening face-to-face. So there was a niche of people that were working online with media, but most of the educators were not. So that was a very, very big challenge, and I think all universities rose to the challenge. So that is why I'm looking at this, and that's also a little bit what I'm gonna look at. And I think the first thing to mention about those structures is that they are in an in-between space between different things. So mainly in between the academic sphere and the more administrative or university administration sphere. And that is not an easy task at all. So you have the academic sphere, you have faculty, you have quite some rigor there, and then you have the different offices that have to deal with university administration, from student registration, also libraries, IT services, so all sorts of services that are around that. And the centers are usually placed somewhere in between. Now, if we go very concretely, they are sometimes placed, or they are formally placed either in one side or the other, but it doesn't mean much. That is what's on the paper. But they operate in between those spaces. And I think this is really important to keep in mind from the very beginning, also when we start thinking about their roles, their activities, their success or, lack of, the fact that they are always in between and they have to achieve this balance between the two. They have, the target audience is more in the academic side, but they have to operate a network of a lot of other actors on campus that are often on the other side. And also relation to the university management. It's also quite an important aspect in terms of positioning. Whether teaching and learning centers, who are they reporting to? Are they invited to sit at the table when policy decisions are made at university, and so on? But I'm going to come back to that a bit later. But teaching and learning centers also have a different, especially if they are at the central level, because I just wanted to mention one more thing before that. You can find them, again, it's very complex, so you can find them centrally in some universities, but in some places, some more decentralized universities, you can also, or only sometimes, find them at faculty level or at department level. So you might have teaching and learning people or teams, depending on the resources, in each faculty. So then you have disciplinary-based support, which, of course, has its own role. So you have sometimes those two things going alongside, the central support and the faculty support, or the discipline-based support. In some places, you only have one of the two, so that depends. But where you have the central centers, they really have quite an interesting role of overseeing the entire ecosystem. And that's linked to what I said before, that they are placed in between, but that also implies a good knowledge of both worlds. And also the potential, of course, that comes with it to facilitate that those two worlds work together. Now, this would be really utopic. We do work together because we have to, but it's not always very, very effective. But I really wanted to emphasize the fact that the centers could potentially provide that sort of service in a way to the university, because they could link all the different pieces of the puzzle. And in fact, they do. If you talk to people working, and I talked to quite a few people working in teaching and learning centers, and also my research in the US was interviewing directors specifically, so they would actually tell me more about the strategies. I think the thing that came up most is they see themselves as connectors, bridge builders between different parts of the campus, of the university. And that's exactly because of their position that I mentioned before. So they often would say, yes, we are kind of the only ones, because we work in silos at universities. I'm sure you recognize that. Everyone is in their own bubble, not only academic and administrative oriented, but generally, disciplinary bubbles, thematic bubbles, all sorts of bubbles. And these people, because they sort of have this overview, they could link the bubbles or burst the bubbles sometimes. And they do. They kind of almost take it upon them where you have this will and this mission to build these bridges. And that can have practical implications, people working together on projects. So for instance, we would bring in, whenever we organize something, I'm based in a faculty-based teaching and learning center. We are bringing together people from library, from the IT unit, from student counseling, for instance, in some projects we are doing. And this is exactly what many centers are doing, trying to bridge those gaps, but of knowledge in a way, but not only of knowledge, but of knowledge about what each other are doing, which is really, it's a very tricky thing to do in a university environment. Another role that was mentioned very often is that of offering a safe space. A safe space for faculty. So our main target audience, right? Sometimes some centers, I have to put here a small asterisk, some centers also directly work with students. So they include, bigger centers would include also student-facing services, student counseling and so on. But often they're outside, they're in this ecosystem that is bridged sometimes, but not inside the center. The main target audience is our professors, educators, lecturers, teaching staff, let's call them. And the idea is to offer them a safe space to come and talk together, reflect, and talk about teaching and learning. And this is not something that happens organically or naturally either, especially not at research-intensive universities. There, you really have to almost like, create the space, make the space, and also give a little bit of a safety net for people to do that. So what that means, and the tension here, is that you portray yourself almost as a neutral space, a safe space, but of course nothing can be neutral. If centers, as I already mentioned, are also embedded in the university administration, and more so with the pandemic. In fact, in the US, majority of the directors of teaching and learning centers during the pandemic and in the past years have become vice provosts or associate provosts, so they really got positions at the higher ranking university management, and that they felt could jeopardize the way they are perceived by faculty. So there is a tension there as well. You want to provide this safe space, this neutral space, but you don't want to be perceived by your audience, by the professors, as an arm of the administration. So again, very, very tight balance there that you need to walk all the time if you work in this type of centers. Of course, the main role is that of support. That's, maybe I should have started with that one, but I started with the more philosophical ones, the bridging and the safe space. But yeah, of course, the main role is to support teaching staff, to support students. Well, eventually, anyway, indirectly, you support students as well by supporting teaching staff. But that's really the core role. And the support also happens in many ways. So you would have teaching certificates or workshops, you would have all sorts of projects, funding that teaching staff can get for innovative projects. There are really different ways. You can do observations in the classroom, consultations. There are many, many ways, and in fact, during the pandemic, we developed quite a large range of support. I think the key here is to try to support people where they are, to meet them where they are, because everyone is at a different level, a different stage in their career, a different level of interest in teaching or rapport with teaching, and you don't want to impose a one-fits-all recipe, but you want to develop more personalized in a way, but also some paths where everyone can kind of just jump in and feel supported. Another role is to map, to signpost everything that's happening on campus. Again, that has to do with this Lighthouse function, because the people in the center usually know a lot about what's going on and what is offered, what is being offered by the different offices on campus. They can also, another way of supporting faculty is to signpost all that offer, because that's also not very clear. Sometimes support exists in various offices, but if you are a new teacher especially, it's very, very difficult to find it. So the centers also simply, it's not a simple exercise at all, but it's a very useful one to map the existing offer and thus be a first port of call. So, if people come to us, we direct them, we know exactly where to direct them. And that's very, very important as well. Innovation, of course, also comes up quite a lot, offering a space for innovation, for trial and error. Again, with an asterisk here, because we are still at university, and a lot of people are still afraid of innovating because that might hurt their careers. There is not that much we can do as teaching and learning centers at that point, so there has to be, our endeavors should be met from the top, a little, let's say like that, bluntly, with rewards and recognition incentives. Sometimes they're present, but not all the time. So innovation can happen, should happen, we can support it with technology or without technology, but sometimes there needs to be more than that. A lot of sharing, communities, learning from each other, trying to find complementarity and learn from each other, and again, that's linked to the bridging. And another interesting, I think it's the last role I'm mentioning here, is, again, not very far from what I mentioned before, but centers for teaching and learning also see themselves as a node in a network, and sometimes the most important node. And that's very, like the node that sort of connects all the others, so one of those big ones there. And this happens mostly, again, you might recognize, depending on your institution, some institutions are quite decentralized. And there, of course, having one body, one unit that provides all the teaching and learning support is not really accepted or enough, or whatever you want to say. So there are many providers, but the center can still carve a role for itself as the node in this network. And that's equally good. You don't have to provide everything yourself, doesn't have to come from the top, but then, you know, linking, again, those things is very, very important. And also helping people grow. So as I said, meeting them where they are, beginning of their career, later on, and so on. And also trying to create communities. This is a very interesting thing. In the States, I've seen much more learning communities, and that is linked to support, but it's not structured support. It's not workshops, programs, and so on, but just communities, just, you know, planting the seeds and see what develops. Often, well, always, it takes time, patience, resistance to the feeling of frustration that nobody comes. There might be one person first, there might be 2 people in a week, and maybe there are 9 people after a year. But if those people share and have trust, then you actually achieved something. But it takes a bit of patience, and a lot of us don't have the time and the patience. It can be worth it, I feel. These are the current roles. But how about the future? What are the challenges that I identified through my research, but also through my work in relation to this space? And it's really difficult. I don't have a crystal ball. None of us really has. But if history tells us something, how these centers developed, and also how they operated during the pandemic, how they gathered, pooled all the resources, and so on, we can maybe predict a few things, but especially identify a few challenges for this space. So, first of all, it's really, really important to mention, and I already did, that they started getting more and more a seat at the table. And that means that they are much more drawn into the university administration than they were before. And sometimes, and again, here I'm talking more from my American research, and I'm aware that in Europe things are very diverse. I still haven't done the same research in Europe, but the centers in the US were a little bit afraid of that, or wary, not afraid. They welcomed this trend. They were happy to be on all those committees, you know, like curriculum committee, assessment committee, technology enhanced learning committee and stuff like that. But that also meant that they might lose credibility with their direct target audience, that teachers might basically say, your administration, you will evaluate me, you will police me, I will not come. So that's, again, a fine line there to walk. Good and bad. And I don't think we can really resist it. This is happening. We are getting a seat at the table. So try to make the most of it, not to compromise the role and the mission of the center. And the other thing is really trying to future-proof, I would say, the centers. Because history showed, I think in the US, but definitely in other places too, that centers are a little bit vulnerable to changes in university management, for instance. They were usually created when a rector or a dean really liked or was very fond of teaching and wanted to support teaching, but often when the tide changes after 5 years or so, it might be that these centers were defunded or sometimes closed, and even with them having really raised in their reputation during the pandemic, this is not something that we would exclude. This can still happen. So what do we do to keep our work relevant? Of course, it is relevant, but make sure that the others understand it's relevant. And this is a continuous challenge. This I don't really have the answer to, but I think all the roles that I mentioned before and all the aspects I mentioned before contribute to this. I think the key is really becoming embedded at a granular level at different levels. in different types of work, supporting students, integrating technology, supporting staff at different stages in their career. If we are a partner that nobody can avoid, basically, then you sort of succeeded. If you are some unit that sort of sits a bit externally and is very dependent as the wind blows, then you are in danger. And again, I would say the very important thing are networks. Internal networks, I mentioned quite a bit already before, this bridge builder and the network builder on campus, within the university, but also externally. So that is the last point I want to make. I did ask in my research about, do you actually work with other centers? I mean, that's a normal question to ask because we can't all do everything. And everyone also almost had like a disappointed face saying, yeah, actually, we would like to do more. I know we could do more, but we don't really, because we focus also, the past years were a bit busy internally, but we focus on internal work. So we don't really have the time and capacity, but we would like to connect more with other centers. And what they do usually is go regionally. So connect with centers around there in their region. And what I also saw in the States is that they connect with centers from the same type of university, like Ivy League would work with Ivy League, or community colleges, more community colleges. So they wouldn't really cross those boundaries, which is interesting because I would say everything is about crossing boundaries as well, but there are quite a lot of barriers there. So as I said, opportunities and challenges, but the networks really can offer opportunities because they can help us, first of all, understand each other, exchange, learn, be inspired, but why not also eventually pool resources, because we don't all have to reinvent the wheel and provide all sort of support for everyone. For instance, we at Maastricht University do PBL, problem-based learning, as our signature pedagogy. We also provide support for that. Not every other university would have to provide support for that. We could, take care of that part of the puzzle and maybe get something back from others that we don't need to develop ourselves. But yeah, maybe that's a little bit too far-fetched thinking, but why not? I think on a Wednesday morning we can have a bit of utopia. Thank you very much.